The gunshot echoed across the valley as Xavier Blackwood's bullet found its mark, bringing down the buck he'd been tracking since dawn. It was autumn of 1875, and winter would soon grip the Montana territory with merciless fingers. A man living alone needed to prepare, and Xavier was nothing if not prepared. He slung the deer over his horse's back, patting the animal's neck. "Good work today, Thunder." The dappled gray stallion snorted in response, seemingly eager to return to the warmth of the stable as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the jagged mountains. Xavier's homestead sat nestled in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, far enough from the nearest town of Whiteridge to afford him the solitude he craved, yet close enough that he could make the journey when supplies ran low. A modest 2-story cabin with a wrap-around porch. It wasn't fancy, but it was built with his own hands after leaving Texas 5 years ago. The life of a ranch hand had lost its appeal after the war. Too many men, too much noise, too many memories. Out here, with only the mountains and wildlife for company, Xavier had found a measure of peace. At 32, he'd resigned himself to a life of solitude. It suited him just fine. As he approached his property, Thunder's ears perked up. Xavier noticed it too. Something was different. Smoke curled from his chimney, though he'd banked the fire before leaving at dawn. His hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver on his hip. 5 years of solitude had made him cautious, perhaps overly so. Raiders weren't uncommon in these parts, though they typically avoided isolated cabins in favor of more lucrative targets like stagecoaches or small settlements. He dismounted quietly, tethering Thunder to a tree at the edge of the clearing. Drawing his revolver, Xavier approached his cabin slowly, his footfalls silent against the carpet of pine needles. As he neared the porch, he heard voices soft, almost whispers coming from inside. The front door was slightly ajar. He'd definitely closed it when he left. Xavier took a deep breath, steadying himself before pushing the door open with the barrel of his gun. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. 2 young women sat huddled by his fireplace, their thin frames wrapped in worn shawls that had seen better days. Their faces, though smudged with dirt, couldn't hide their striking features identical in every way. Twins. They couldn't have been older than 20. They gasped in unison when they saw him, scrambling to their feet with fear in their eyes. "Please," one of them said, her voice trembling. "We meant no harm. We were just so cold." Xavier lowered his gun slowly, taking in the scene. Nothing appeared to be missing or disturbed, save for the fire they'd stoked. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice gruff from disuse. "What are you doing in my home?" The second twin stepped forward slightly, her shoulders squared despite her obvious fear. "I'm Charlotte, and this is my sister Catherine. We've been traveling for days. We saw your cabin and thought..." Her voice faltered. "We thought it might be abandoned," Catherine finished for her sister. "The door wasn't locked, and we were so hungry and cold. We're sorry. We'll leave right away." As if on cue, Catherine's stomach growled loudly in the quiet room. The twins exchanged embarrassed glances, their cheeks flushing beneath the grime. Xavier holstered his gun with a sigh. "Wait here," he said curtly, before stepping back outside. He returned to Thunder, untying the deer and hoisting it onto his shoulders. By the time he re-entered the cabin, the twins had gathered their meager belongings, a single small satchel between them, and were standing nervously by the door. "Sit down," Xavier instructed, nodding toward the worn sofa. "I need to take care of this meat before it spoils." The twins hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. "You're not leaving yet," he clarified, somewhat awkwardly. "Not in this cold and not hungry." Relief washed over their identical faces as they sank back down onto the sofa, watching as Xavier moved efficiently around the small kitchen area, hanging the deer from a hook on the back porch to be properly dressed later. He returned and began rummaging through his cupboards, pulling out a loaf of bread he'd baked 2 days prior, along with some dried venison and a jar of preserved peaches. "It's not much," he said, setting the food on the table. but it'll fill your bellies." The twins approached the table cautiously, as if afraid he might snatch the food away at any moment. "Thank you," Charlotte whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "We haven't eaten in 2 days." Xavier felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest as he watched them break the bread with trembling hands. They ate slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as their bodies remembered what it was to be fed. "Where are you headed?" he asked, pouring them each a cup of coffee from the pot he'd set to brew. Catherine swallowed a bite of bread. "Anywhere that'll have us. Our parents died of fever last spring in Missouri. The bank took our farm. We've been moving west ever since, looking for work." 2 young women traveling alone, Xavier frowned. "That's dangerous territory." "We didn't have much choice," Charlotte said softly. "We stayed with our aunt for a while, but her husband—" She trailed off, her eyes darkening with unspoken memories. Xavier understood. He'd seen enough of the world to know what happened to vulnerable women under the roofs of certain men. "What kind of work are you looking for?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Anything honest," Catherine replied. "We can cook, clean, sew." "Charlotte's good with numbers, and I can read and write well enough." "We're quick learners." Xavier nodded, taking a sip of his own coffee as he considered the women before him. They were clearly exhausted, their clothes threadbare but mended with careful stitches. Despite their circumstances, there was a dignity about them, a resilience that stirred something in him. He glanced around his cabin, clean enough for a bachelor, but lacking the touches that would make it truly a home. The winter would be long and harsh. He had planned to make the journey into Whiteridge soon to stock up on supplies, maybe hire someone to help with the hunting and chopping wood. Having 2 extra pairs of hands around might not be such a bad thing. "I could use some help around here," he said finally, surprising himself almost as much as the twins. "Winter's coming, and there's plenty to be done. If you're willing to work, you can stay until spring. I'll provide room and board, plus a small wage you can save." The twins stared at him in disbelief. "You'd let us stay?" Charlotte asked. "You don't even know us." Xavier shrugged. "I'm a decent judge of character. You didn't steal anything even though you had the chance. That counts for something in my book." Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what would be expected of us, exactly?" Xavier understood her suspicion. "Cooking, cleaning, helping with preserving the game I bring in. Nothing improper," he added firmly. "You'd have the loft room to yourselves. I sleep down here." The twins exchanged a long look, seeming to communicate without words as only twins can. "We accept," they said in unison, then laughed at their synchronicity. Xavier nodded, feeling unexpectedly lighter than he had in years. "Good, now eat up. Tomorrow we'll head into town for supplies. You'll both need warmer clothes before the snow flies." As dusk settled over the Montana wilderness, Xavier Blackwood found himself sitting by the fire with 2 unexpected guests, listening to the soft murmur of their voices as they discussed plans for the coming days. For the first time in a long while, his cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a home. Little did he know that this simple act of kindness, offering bread to hungry strangers, would change the course of his life forever. The next morning dawned clear and cold, frost painting delicate patterns on the cabin windows. Xavier woke before sunrise, as was his habit, and stoked the fire before quietly preparing coffee. He half expected to find the twins gone, having taken what they needed and disappeared in the night. But as he moved around the kitchen, he heard soft footsteps on the stairs. Charlotte appeared first, her dark hair neatly braided, wearing the same worn dress as the day before but somehow looking more put together. She smiled tentatively when she saw him. "Good morning," she said softly. "I hope you don't mind that we slept late. It's been a while since we've had a proper bed." Xavier shook his head. "No need to apologize. Coffee, please," she nodded, approaching the kitchen area. "May I help with breakfast? It's the least we can do." Before Xavier could respond, Catherine joined them, looking remarkably like her sister except for a small scar above her right eyebrow, the only visible difference between them. "Something smells wonderful," Catherine said, eyeing the coffee pot. Xavier found himself unexpectedly tongue-tied in the presence of the two young women. He was accustomed to his own company, to the silence of his mornings broken only by the calls of birds or the occasional distant howl of a wolf. "There's flour in that bin," he said finally, gesturing to a wooden container on the counter. "And eggs in the cold box on the porch. I was thinking biscuits, if you know how to make them." Charlotte's face lit up. "Our mother's biscuits were famous in 3 counties. I think we can manage." The sisters moved around the small kitchen with surprising efficiency, working together seamlessly. Xavier watched them for a moment before excusing himself to tend to the horses and other morning chores. When he returned, the cabin was filled with the mouth-watering aroma of fresh biscuits, and the table was set with the mismatched plates and cups he'd accumulated over the years. "This looks—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Nice." Catherine smiled, placing a plate of golden brown biscuits in the center of the table. "It's a start. Once we get to town and can stock up on supplies, we'll show you what we can really do." Breakfast was a quiet affair, but not uncomfortably so. The twins asked polite questions about the town of Whiteridge and what supplies they might need for winter. Xavier, usually a man of few words, found himself explaining the harsh Montana winters and the importance of preparation. "It's about a 2-hour ride to town," he explained as they finished eating. "We should leave soon if we want to get back before dark." "We only have 1 horse between us," Charlotte said hesitantly. "Will that be a problem?" Xavier considered this. "Thunder can carry double for short distances. And I have a pack horse for the supplies. We'll manage." An hour later, they were on the trail to Whiteridge. Xavier rode Thunder with Catherine seated behind him, clutching his waist somewhat awkwardly. Charlotte rode his pack horse, a steady old mare named Daisy. The morning air was crisp, the forest around them peaceful save for the occasional rustle of wildlife. "How long have you lived out here alone?" Catherine asked, her voice close to his ear. 5 years, Xavier replied. "Built the cabin myself after I came north from Texas." "Texas?" Charlotte chimed in from beside them. "Were you a cowboy?" Xavier couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. "For a time, drove cattle up from San Antonio to Kansas mostly. Then the war came." He felt Catherine stiffen slightly behind him. The war was still a raw subject for many, regardless of which side they'd been on. "You fought?" she asked cautiously. "Confederate cavalry," he answered simply. "Not something I care to dwell on." To their credit, neither twin pressed him further on the matter. Instead, Charlotte changed the subject, pointing out a hawk circling overhead and asking about the local wildlife. The remainder of the journey passed pleasantly, with Xavier occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of information about the area. By the time Whiteridge came into view, a small but bustling town, nestled in a valley, he found himself more relaxed in their company than he would have thought possible. Whiteridge consisted of 1 main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, saloon, small hotel, blacksmith, and various other establishments necessary for frontier life. People moved about their business, pausing occasionally to greet one another or exchange news. Xavier helped the twins dismount in front of the general store, aware of the curious glances they were attracting. Newcomers were always a source of interest in small towns, especially young, attractive women. "Mr. Blackwood," called a booming voice as they tied up the horses. "Didn't expect to see you in town so soon." A portly man with an impressive mustache approached, his eyes darting curiously between Xavier and the twins. "Mr. Peterson," Xavier nodded in greeting, "just stocking up for winter. And who might these lovely ladies be?" Peterson asked, tipping his hat to the twins. Xavier hesitated, suddenly realizing he hadn't considered how to explain their presence. Before he could formulate a response, Charlotte stepped forward with a polite smile. "I'm Charlotte Mason, and this is my sister Catherine. Mr. Blackwood has kindly offered us employment for the winter season." Peterson's eyebrows shot up, and Xavier could practically see the gossip forming in the man's mind. A bachelor living alone with two young women would certainly give the town something to talk about. "They'll be helping with the household and preserving game for winter," Xavier added firmly, his tone discouraging further questions. Peterson nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. "Well, welcome to Whiteridge, ladies. I'm sure you'll find our little community quite hospitable." Inside the general store, Xavier handed the twins a small purse of coins. "Get what you need: proper winter clothes, boots, personal items. I'll handle the food supplies." The sisters looked at the money with wide eyes. "This is too much," Catherine protested. "Consider it an advance on your wages," Xavier said. "Montana winters are brutal. You'll need good quality items." As the twins browsed the women's section of the store, Xavier gathered sacks of flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples. He added extra of everything, accounting for 2 additional mouths to feed. Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, approached him as he examined a shelf of canned goods. "Those girls with you, Xavier?" she asked, her voice lowered though her eyes sparkled with curiosity. "They're working for me through the winter," he replied evenly. The woman pursed her lips. "Folks will talk, you know, a single man with 2 young women living under his roof." Xavier turned to face her directly. "Mrs. Peterson, I've been coming to your store for 5 years. Have I ever given you reason to question my character?" She had the grace to look somewhat abashed. "No, but then I'd appreciate if you'd help discourage any unsavory gossip," he said firmly. "Those young ladies have fallen on hard times and need honest work. Nothing more to it than that, Mrs. Peterson nodded, though Xavier doubted the matter would end there. Small towns thrived on gossip, and 3 unmarried people living together in an isolated cabin would provide fodder for weeks of speculation. By the time they finished their shopping, Thunder and Daisy were laden with supplies. Xavier had also purchased a 3rd horse, a gentle chestnut mare, so each of them could ride separately on the return journey and for future trips. "You didn't have to do that," Charlotte said when he presented the mare to her. "We could have continued sharing." Xavier shrugged. "You'll both need your own mounts if you're staying through winter. Sometimes the snow gets so deep the only way to get around is on horseback." They were preparing to leave when a commotion further down the street caught their attention. A group of men had spilled out of the saloon, their loud voices carrying on the afternoon air. One man in particular seemed to be causing trouble, shoving another while hurling insults. Xavier frowned. "Let's head out," he said quietly to the twins. "No need to get involved in saloon disputes." But as they mounted their horses, the troublemaker's gaze fell on them, or more specifically, on Charlotte and Catherine. His face split into an unpleasant grin as he abandoned his previous target and staggered toward them. "Well, what do we have here?" The man slurred, eyeing the twins appreciatively. "Double vision, or has heaven sent down 2 angels at once?" Xavier positioned Thunder between the drunk and the twins. "We're just leaving, Jenkins," he said coldly. "Sleep it off." Jenkins, a local ranch hand with a reputation for causing trouble when drunk, narrowed his eyes. "Since when do you have women at your place, Blackwood, holding out on the rest of us?" Xavier's hand moved subtly toward his gun. "The ladies are under my protection. That's all you need to know." Something in his tone must have penetrated Jenkins' alcohol-fogged brain, because the man took a step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No harm meant," he said, though his eyes told a different story as they lingered on the twins. "Just being friendly to our new neighbors." "We appreciate the welcome," Catherine said diplomatically, though her knuckles were white where she gripped her reins. "But we really must be going before dark." They rode out of town at a brisk pace, Xavier keeping a watchful eye behind them until Whiteridge disappeared from view. "Does that happen often?" Charlotte asked once they were well away from town. Xavier sighed. "Jenkins is harmless when sober, but liquor brings out the worst in him. Most folks in town are decent people." "Will he cause trouble?" Catherine's voice held genuine concern. "Not if he values his hide," Xavier replied grimly. But it might be best if you ladies don't go into town alone, at least for a while. The rest of the journey home was subdued, each lost in their own thoughts. As they crested the final hill and Xavier's cabin came into view, however, the tension seemed to ease. "It looks different somehow," Charlotte remarked, gazing at the simple structure nestled among the pines. "More like home," Catherine finished softly. Xavier glanced at her, surprised by the sentiment and the strange flutter it caused in his chest. These women had been in his life for barely 24 hours. It was far too soon for any of them to be thinking of his cabin as home. And yet, as they unpacked their supplies and settled in for the evening, he couldn't deny that something fundamental had shifted. The cabin felt warmer somehow, more alive with their presence. That night, after a simple but satisfying dinner, Xavier sat on the porch smoking his pipe while the twins washed the dishes inside. The stars were emerging in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. He found himself wondering what twist of fate had brought these two young women to his door and what it might mean for all their futures. For 5 years, he'd convinced himself that solitude was what he wanted, what he deserved. Now, he wasn't so sure. Inside, he heard Charlotte laugh at something her sister said, the sound carrying through the open window like music on the evening breeze. Despite his misgivings about the complications their presence might bring, Xavier couldn't help but smile. Perhaps this winter wouldn't be so long and dark after all. The days fell into a rhythm as October gave way to November. Each morning, Xavier would rise before dawn to tend to the animals and chop wood for the day. By the time he returned to the cabin, the twins would have breakfast waiting hearty meals of biscuits and gravy, flapjacks with maple syrup, or eggs with venison sausage. Charlotte proved to be an exceptional cook, bringing new life to Xavier's simple provisions with herbs she discovered growing wild near the cabin. Catherine, meanwhile, revealed a talent for organization, transforming the somewhat chaotic storage pantry into an efficiently arranged space where everything had its place. Together, they prepared for the coming winter with an intensity born of necessity. Xavier taught them how to clean and prepare game, how to smoke meat for preservation, and how to identify which wild plants were safe to eat. The twins absorbed every lesson eagerly, their determination to earn their keep evident in everything they did. "You never mentioned what brought you all the way to Montana Territory," Xavier said one evening as they sat by the fire after dinner. The first snow had fallen that day, dusting the landscape with white and reinforcing the importance of their preparations. The twins exchanged one of their silent communications before Charlotte answered. "After our parents died and we left our aunt's home, we tried finding work in Missouri, but 2 unmarried women traveling alone." She shook her head. "The respectable jobs wouldn't have us without references, and the other jobs, well, they weren't the kind we were willing to take. We heard that the Western Territories offered more opportunities," Catherine continued. "That women were scarce and valued for more than just," she broke off, blushing slightly. Xavier nodded, understanding what remained unsaid. "So you just started walking west?" "We took odd jobs where we could," Charlotte explained. "Laundry, field work, cooking. Saved enough to buy 1 horse between us, but as winter approached, work became scarcer. By the time we reached your cabin, we'd gone 2 days without food," Catherine admitted, "if you hadn't taken us in." She left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Xavier studied them in the firelight. Despite the hardships they'd endured, there was no self-pity in their account, only a matter-of-fact recounting of their circumstances. He found himself admiring their resilience more with each passing day. "Well," he said finally, "it seems fortune favored us all that day." Charlotte smiled, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "Indeed it did, Mr. Blackwood." "Xavier," he corrected her. "After a month of sharing meals and work, I think we can dispense with formalities." Both twins looked pleased at this small gesture of familiarity. "Xavier," Catherine tested the name, nodding approvingly. It suits you, strong but with a hint of mystery. He raised an eyebrow. Mystery, she laughed, the sound warming the room better than any fire. You must admit you're something of an enigma. The educated cowboy turned mountain man, living alone in the wilderness with only books and horses for company. Xavier glanced at his bookshelf, well stocked with volumes of history, philosophy, and literature, one of the few indulgences he'd allowed himself. Books don't judge or ask uncomfortable questions, he said with a slight smile. Unlike nosy twins, Charlotte suggested with mock innocence. I didn't say that, Xavier protested, though he was smiling now too. You didn't have to, Catherine replied, her expression growing more serious. We know we've intruded on your solitude. If our questions ever overstep, they haven't, he assured her quickly. Too quickly, perhaps, as both twins gave him curious looks. I mean, he continued more measured, you've both been respectful of my privacy. An awkward silence fell, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Xavier wasn't accustomed to such conversations, to the subtle dance of words and meanings that occurred between people who were becoming more than mere acquaintances, but weren't quite friends. Charlotte stood suddenly, smoothing her skirt. I should check on the bread dough for tomorrow, she said, though Xavier suspected it was merely an excuse to break the tension. And I need to finish mending that shirt, Catherine added, rising as well. Good night, Xavier. Good night, he responded, watching as they ascended the stairs to the loft that had become their domain. Left alone with his thoughts, Xavier poured himself a small measure of whiskey and stared into the fire. The twins' presence had changed more than just the organization of his pantry or the quality of his meals. They'd changed the very atmosphere of his home, filling it with conversation and laughter that he hadn't realized he'd been missing. More disconcerting still was his growing awareness of Catherine as more than just one of two helpful houseguests. He'd caught himself watching her as she worked, admiring the graceful efficiency of her movements, the thoughtful expression that crossed her face when she was absorbed in a task. When she smiled, really smiled, not the polite expression she wore when first arriving, it transformed her entire countenance, revealing a dimple in her right cheek that her sister lacked. Xavier drained his whiskey, chiding himself for such thoughts. The twins were under his protection. They depended on him for shelter and safety. Any feelings beyond neighborly concern would be a betrayal of that trust. Besides, come spring, they would likely move on to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Becoming attached would only lead to disappointment for all involved. With that sobering thought, Xavier banked the fire for the night and retired to his small bedroom off the main living area, determined to maintain the proper distance between himself and his houseguests, no matter how increasingly difficult that was becoming. The first major snowstorm of the season hit in early December, howling down from the mountains with a ferocity that kept them housebound for 3 days. Xavier had experienced many such storms in his years on the mountain, but never with company. The close quarters could have bred tension, but instead, a deeper camaraderie developed. The twins taught Xavier card games their father had played with them as children. In return, he shared stories of his cattle driving days and the characters he'd met on the frontier. On the evening of the third day, as the storm finally began to abate, Catherine discovered the small fiddle hanging on Xavier's wall, an item he'd nearly forgotten he owned. Do you play? She asked, her eyes lighting up with interest. Xavier shook his head. Not well. It belonged to a friend who passed during the war. I keep it to remember him. May I? Catherine asked gently. My father taught us both, though I took to it more than Charlotte. Xavier hesitated only briefly before nodding. Catherine carefully took down the instrument, checking its strings and tuning it with a practiced hand. When she drew the bow across the strings, the sweet, melancholy notes filled the cabin. She played a simple folk tune, one Xavier vaguely recognized from his childhood in Kentucky. Charlotte began to hum along, and then to sing softly. her clear voice blending perfectly with the fiddle's tones. Xavier sat transfixed, watching Catherine's fingers dance across the strings, her eyes half closed in concentration. There was something almost magical about the scene, the warm cabin, the snow falling gently outside the windows now that the storm had passed, and this unexpected music filling spaces that had known only silence for too long. When the song ended, Catherine looked up to find Xavier watching her intently. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared appreciation for the moment they'd created. Charlotte, observant as always, glanced between them with a thoughtful expression. "I think I'll turn in early," she announced, rising from her chair. "The storms kept us all cooped up, and I could use some extra rest." Before either Xavier or Catherine could protest, she had disappeared up the stairs, leaving them alone in the main room. Catherine carefully set the fiddle aside. "Thank you for letting me play," she said softly. "Music has always been a comfort, especially during difficult times." "You play beautifully," Xavier replied, his voice equally quiet. "Your father taught you well." She smiled, that transformative smile that never failed to catch his breath. "He was a patient teacher, said I had a natural ear." Her expression grew wistful. "I miss him terribly sometimes, both our parents." Without thinking, Xavier moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "Tell me about them," he invited. Catherine looked surprised by his interest, but began to speak, describing her father's gentle humor and her mother's strength of character. As she talked, Xavier found himself drawn not just to her words, but to the animated way she spoke, her hands gesturing expressively, her eyes reflecting both sorrow and joy at the memories. "What about your family?" she asked eventually. "You've mentioned Kentucky, but little else." Xavier rarely spoke of his past, finding it easier to leave those memories undisturbed. But something about Catherine's open expression made him want to share parts of himself he usually kept hidden. "My father was a schoolteacher," he began, "strict but fair. My mother died when I was young. I barely remember her. It was just my father and me until I was 16 when he remarried. My stepmother was difficult. I left home soon after, found work with cattle outfits heading west." "And the war?" Catherine asked tentatively. Xavier's expression darkened. "Changed everything, as it did for most. I lost friends on both sides, saw things no man should see." He paused, then added, "Came out of it different than I went in." Catherine nodded, not pressing for details he wasn't ready to give. Instead, she gently placed her hand over his where it rested on the sofa between them. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. The touch of her hand sent warmth spreading up his arm. It had been so long since anyone had touched him with such gentleness that he found himself momentarily frozen, unsure how to respond. Catherine must have mistaken his stillness for discomfort, because she began to withdraw her hand. Without thinking, Xavier turned his palm up, capturing her fingers with his own. They sat like that for several heartbeats, hand in hand, neither speaking nor needing to. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, the wind had died down to a whisper, and the snow fell in lazy, fat flakes that gathered on the windowsills. Finally, Catherine squeezed his hand once before releasing it. "I should join Charlotte," she said, though she made no immediate move to leave. "Tomorrow we'll be busy, clearing paths after the storm." Xavier nodded, both relieved and disappointed by the return to practical matters. "Yes, there'll be much to do." Catherine stood, smoothing her skirt in a gesture he'd come to recognize as a habit when she was gathering her thoughts. "Good night, Xavier," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that lingered even after she'd ascended the stairs. "Good night, Catherine," he replied, remaining seated as he listened to her footsteps crossing the loft above. Xavier stayed by the fire long after she'd gone, contemplating the unexpected turn his life had taken. For years, he'd convinced himself that solitude was what he deserved after the things he'd done during the war. But the twins' arrival had awakened something he'd thought long dead. The desire for connection, for sharing his life with others, with Catherine, if he was honest with himself. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. Spring seemed both too far away and not distant enough too far to waste these precious days in uncertainty, yet not distant enough to prepare for what might happen when the time came for the twins to move on. As Xavier finally banked the fire for the night, one thing became clear: his carefully ordered existence had been permanently disrupted. And there would be no returning to the solitary life he'd known before two hungry twins knocked on his door. Christmas approached with a quietness that belied the anticipation building within the cabin. Xavier had never made much of the holiday during his years alone, but the twins spoke of family traditions with such fondness that he found himself wanting to give them some semblance of celebration. On a clear day in mid-December, Xavier rode alone into the forest, returning hours later with a small pine tree strapped to Thunder's back. The twins' delight when they saw it was worth the effort 10 times over. "A Christmas tree," Charlotte exclaimed, clapping her hands together. "It's perfect." They spent the evening decorating it with handmade ornaments, pine cones dipped in melted candle wax, paper stars cut from old newspaper, and strings of dried berries they'd collected in the fall. Xavier watched with growing warmth as the simple tree was transformed into something magical under their care. As Christmas Eve approached, the twins became secretive, whispering together and hiding away in the loft at odd hours. Xavier pretended not to notice, understanding they were likely preparing some sort of surprise for the holiday. What he couldn't hide was his own anticipation. On his last trip to Whiteridge, he'd purchased gifts for both women, practical items, but selected with care. For Charlotte, a set of high-quality cooking spices that had arrived on the stagecoach from back east. For Catherine, a leather-bound journal with blank pages, having noticed how she often jotted down thoughts on scraps of paper. On Christmas Eve, after a dinner more elaborate than usual, featuring a wild turkey Xavier had hunted specifically for the occasion, they gathered around the fire. Snow fell softly outside, accumulating on the already considerable drifts surrounding the cabin. "In our family," Charlotte began, "we had a tradition of opening one gift on Christmas Eve and saving the rest for morning." Xavier nodded. "We did something similar when I was a boy." Catherine smiled. "Then perhaps we could continue that tradition tonight." She disappeared up the stairs, returning moments later with 2 carefully wrapped packages. Charlotte followed with another small bundle. "Ladies first," Xavier insisted when they were all seated again. The twins exchanged glances before Charlotte handed her package to Xavier. "This is from both of us," she explained. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in a deep blue that matched his eyes, the wool soft and the stitches even. "We unraveled one of our old shawls," Catherine explained. "It wasn't much use anymore, but the wool was still good. It's—" Xavier ran his fingers over the careful work, thinking of the hours they must have spent on it. "Thank you. It's finer than anything I've owned." Next came Catherine's gift, a pair of leather gloves, the seams reinforced with careful stitching. "I noticed your old ones were wearing through," she said. "These should last longer." Xavier was genuinely touched by their thoughtfulness. Despite their limited resources, they'd managed to create gifts that were both practical and personal. "Now yours," he said, retrieving the packages he'd hidden behind his chair. Charlotte was delighted with the spices, immediately opening each small tin to inhale their exotic aromas and making plans for the dishes she would create. When Catherine unwrapped the journal, her eyes widened in surprise before lifting to meet his. "How did you know?" she asked softly. Xavier felt a flush of pleasure at having chosen well. "I've seen you writing. Thought you might like something proper to keep your thoughts in." "It's perfect," she said, running her fingers over the embossed leather cover. "Truly." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken meaning, until Charlotte cleared her throat gently. "There's one more tradition we always observed," she said, moving to the small cabinet where they kept the cooking supplies. She returned with a bottle of Xavier's whiskey and 3 cups. A toast to those not with us, but always remembered. Xavier raised an eyebrow at their appropriation of his liquor, but said nothing as Charlotte poured small measures into each cup. "To our parents," Catherine said, raising her cup. "Who taught us love, courage, and resilience." "To friends lost," Xavier added, thinking of the fiddle's original owner and countless others who hadn't returned from the war. "And to new beginnings," Charlotte finished, with a meaningful glance between Xavier and her sister. They drank, the whiskey burning pleasantly on its way down. Xavier noticed Catherine suppress a small cough, clearly not accustomed to strong spirits, and found the gesture endearing. As the evening progressed, the conversation flowed easily between them. Charlotte shared stories of Christmases past, while Xavier recounted tales of holidays spent on cattle drives, where celebrations were makeshift but heartfelt. Catherine was quieter than usual, occasionally contributing to the conversation, but often simply watching Xavier with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. When their eyes met, she didn't look away as she might have weeks ago, but held his gaze with a steadiness that sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the fire or whiskey. Eventually, Charlotte yawned dramatically. "I think the day's excitement has worn me out," she announced, standing. "Don't you feel tired, Catherine?" Catherine shot her sister an exasperated look that Xavier pretended not to notice. "Actually, I'm quite awake," she replied. "But you go ahead, I'll be up shortly." After Charlotte had gone upstairs, a comfortable silence fell between the remaining two. Catherine moved to sit closer to the fire, the flames casting a golden glow on her features. "Thank you," she said after a moment, "for making this Christmas special we didn't expect." "Nor did I," Xavier admitted, "but I'm glad we did." Catherine smiled, tracing the embossed pattern on her new journal with her fingertips. "When we first arrived, I was so focused on survival that I didn't think beyond getting through winter. But now, Xavier prompted when she didn't continue. She looked up at him, her expression open and vulnerable in a way that made his heart constrict. "Now, I find myself thinking about what comes after winter, about possibilities I hadn't considered before." Xavier knew he should be cautious, should maintain the careful distance he'd tried to preserve. But sitting there in the firelight, with Catherine looking at him as though he represented those possibilities she spoke of, caution seemed a poor substitute for honesty. "I've been thinking about that too," he confessed. "More than I should, perhaps." Catherine set the journal aside and moved to join him on the sofa, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent she'd managed to preserve even in the depths of winter. "Why should?" she asked. "Is it so wrong to think about the future?" Xavier sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Catherine, when spring comes, you and Charlotte will have options. Whiteridge is growing. The railway will reach it within a year or two. There will be opportunities for 2 capable young women that don't involve being stranded in a cabin with a man who's spent too many years alone." "Is that what you think? That we feel stranded?" She shook her head, disappointment evident in her expression. "After all these months, you still don't understand." "What don't I understand?" he asked, genuinely confused by her reaction. Catherine turned to face him fully, her eyes intent on his. "That some people choose the life they want based on who they want to share it with, not just where it might lead them." The implication of her words hung in the air between them, clear yet still unspoken. Xavier felt a surge of hope so powerful it nearly took his breath away, followed immediately by doubt. "Catherine," he began carefully, "I'm nearly 13 years your senior. I've lived a hard life, seen and done things I'm not proud of." "You don't," she interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "Don't tell me what I deserve. I know my own mind and heart, Xavier. I always have." Before he could respond, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a kiss so light and brief it might have been imagined. But the warmth that spread through him was undeniably real, as was the look in her eyes when she pulled back to gauge his reaction. For a moment, Xavier couldn't move, stunned by both her boldness and the realization of how desperately he'd wanted this very thing. Then, slowly, he raised his hand to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Catherine," he whispered, her name a prayer and a question all at once. Her answer was to lean into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm not asking for promises," she said softly. "Just possibility." Xavier drew her closer, his other hand finding the small of her back. "There's been nothing but possibility since the day you arrived," he admitted. This time when they kissed, it was neither brief nor light. It was a meeting of equals, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been building through shared work and quiet conversations, through meals prepared together and evenings spent by the fire. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "What about Charlotte?" he asked, suddenly remembering Catherine's sister. "Won't she expect to move on come spring?" Catherine smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Charlotte has been trying to push us together for weeks. Haven't you noticed how often she conveniently remembers tasks that take her away from the cabin, leaving us alone?" Xavier blinked, thinking back on numerous occasions when Charlotte had insisted on gathering herbs alone or checking the smokehouse while he and Catherine remained inside. "She has, hasn't she?" he said with dawning realization. Catherine laughed softly. "My sister knows me better than anyone. She saw how I felt about you before I was ready to admit it to myself." "And how do you feel?" Xavier asked, needing to hear the words. Catherine's expression grew serious. "I feel that I've found someone worth staying for, someone whose strength and kindness have shown me what it means to build a life with purpose." She paused, then added simply, "I feel that I'm falling in love with you, Xavier Blackwood." The words sent a jolt through him, fear and joy intermingled so completely he couldn't separate them. It had been so long since anyone had loved him, so long since he'd allowed himself to love in return, that the emotion felt almost foreign. "I don't know if I remember how to do this," he admitted. "How to be what someone needs." Catherine took his hand, interlacing their fingers. "Then we'll learn together, day by day." As they sat together in the warm glow of the fire, the Christmas tree twinkling with its simple decorations, Xavier felt something settle within him, a sense of rightness, of coming home in a way that had nothing to do with the physical structure around them and everything to do with the woman beside him. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet white. But inside Xavier Blackwood's cabin, something new was blooming despite the winter's chill hope, possibility, and the first tender shoots of a love that would grow stronger with each passing day. The winter deepened, January bringing with it temperatures so cold that the creek behind the cabin froze solid and the windows frosted over even with the fire burning day and night. Yet inside, warmth of another kind flourished. Xavier and Catherine's relationship evolved with a careful tenderness, both aware they were building something precious and determined not to rush. They shared quiet moments, hands touching while working together, private smiles across the dinner table, and increasingly, stolen kisses when Charlotte was occupied elsewhere. For her part, Charlotte seemed genuinely pleased by the development, though sometimes Xavier caught a fleeting wistfulness in her expression when she observed them together. "Does your sister ever feel like she's being left behind?" Xavier asked Catherine one afternoon as they mended harnesses in the barn, the only place they could speak privately without Charlotte overhearing. Catherine's hands stilled on the leather strap she was repairing. "Charlotte has always been the more independent of us," she said after a moment. "Even as children, I was the one who needed companionship more, while she was content with her own thoughts." She resumed her work, her movements precise. "But yes, I think sometimes she wonders what her own future holds. It's different for her, seeing me find something she hasn't yet found for herself." Xavier nodded, understanding. "When spring comes, if she wants to move on to Whiteridge or beyond, she won't go without knowing I'm settled and happy," Catherine said with certainty. "That's who she is." "But I've been thinking." She hesitated, suddenly looking nervous. "Go on," Xavier encouraged. What if we built another small cabin, not far from here but enough to give everyone some independence? Charlotte could have her own place, close enough for company but separate enough to build her own life. Xavier considered the idea. It made practical sense. The twins had shown themselves more than capable of managing on their own, and having Charlotte nearby would ease any concerns about her safety while still giving all of them appropriate space. It could work, he agreed. There's good land about a quarter-mile downstream. Close enough to share resources, far enough for privacy. Catherine's smile was radiant. Do you think we could manage it? Before spring? With 3 of us working, yes, Xavier said, warming to the plan. I've got enough timber seasoning in the woodshed for a small structure. Nothing fancy at first, but we could improve it over time. Catherine set aside her work and moved to sit beside him on the rough bench. You do that. For Charlotte, Xavier took her hand, rubbing his thumb across her knuckles. For all of us, he corrected gently. This past winter has taught me that some burdens are lighter when shared, and some joys are greater. Catherine leaned against his shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her. When did you become so wise, Xavier Blackwood? He chuckled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Somewhere between giving bread to hungry strangers and falling in love with one of them, I expect. The words slipped out naturally, without premeditation, but Xavier felt Catherine go still against him. Slowly, she straightened and turned to face him, her eyes searching his. You love me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Xavier realized he'd never actually said the words, though his feelings had been clear at least to him for weeks. I do, he confirmed, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. More than I thought possible. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, though her smile belied any sadness. I was beginning to wonder if you'd ever say it, she admitted, blinking rapidly. I'm sorry it took so long, Xavier said, drawing her closer. I've been out of practice with matters of the heart. Well, Catherine said, her arms sliding around his neck, you'll have plenty of time to improve with practice. Their kiss was deeper this time, filled with newly acknowledged love and promises for the future. Xavier lost himself in the moment, in the feel of Catherine in his arms, and the knowledge that this unexpected happiness was real and lasting. They were so absorbed in each other that neither heard the barn door open, until Charlotte's amused voice broke through their reverie. I see the harness mending is progressing well, she observed dryly. They broke apart, Catherine blushing furiously while Xavier attempted to look dignified despite being caught like a lovesick boy. Charlotte laughed at their expressions. Don't mind me, she said, retrieving a bucket from near the door. Just came for some more snow to melt for washing. As she filled the bucket from a drift just outside the barn, Xavier and Catherine exchanged glances, silently agreeing it was time to share their idea. Charlotte, Catherine called, wait a moment. We'd like to discuss something with you. Charlotte returned, setting the bucket down and regarding them with curiosity. Should I be concerned about the serious expressions, or is this a good something? We hope it's good, Xavier said, gesturing for her to join them on the bench. We've been talking about what happens when spring comes. Charlotte's expression dimmed slightly. I see, I've been thinking about that too. Have you? Catherine asked, reaching for her sister's hand. What thoughts have you had? Charlotte looked between them, her usual confidence momentarily faltering. I've been trying to reconcile my happiness for you, both with my own uncertainty. I don't want to be a burden or an intrusion, but the thought of striking out completely alone. You could never be either, Xavier assured her firmly. You're family now, Charlotte. The simple statement brought tears to Charlotte's eyes. That means more than you know, she said softly. Catherine squeezed her sister's hand. We have an idea, a way for all of us to move forward together, while still respecting each other's independence. As they outlined the plan for a separate cabin, Charlotte's expression transformed from uncertainty to cautious hope. You'd help me build my own place. Close enough to visit, but with my own space. Exactly, Xavier confirmed. You've more than proven you can manage on your own, but none of us need to be completely alone. We can support each other while still building individual lives." Charlotte was quiet for a moment, considering. "It would give me time to figure out what I want next," she said thoughtfully, "and I'd still have both of you nearby." "Is that something you'd want?" Catherine asked, watching her sister carefully. A slow smile spread across Charlotte's face. "Yes," she said with growing certainty. "Yes, I think it's perfect." The relief in the barn was palpable as the three of them began discussing practical details: location, size, materials needed. Xavier found himself marveling at how naturally they worked together, how their different perspectives complemented rather than conflicted. That evening, after Charlotte had gone up to bed, Xavier and Catherine stood on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear, cold sky. "I never expected any of this," Xavier said, his arm around Catherine's waist. "When I built this cabin, I thought I was building a place to be alone with my memories and regrets." Catherine turned in his embrace to face him. "And now I'm building a future," he said simply. "With you, with Charlotte, with whatever comes next." Catherine smiled, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "Speaking of what comes next," she said, a hint of nervousness in her voice, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Xavier raised an eyebrow, waiting. "When we build Charlotte's cabin," Catherine began carefully, "what happens to our living arrangements? Will I stay here with you?" The question carried implications that made Xavier's heart race. Though their feelings for each other were clear, they had maintained propriety in their living situation, with the twins still sharing the loft and Xavier in his small bedroom. "Catherine," he said, taking both her hands in his, "I want nothing more than to build a life with you, to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you each night. But I want to do it right." He paused, gathering his courage. "When spring comes, before we finish Charlotte's cabin, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The joy that illuminated Catherine's face was answer enough, but her whispered yes, and the kiss that followed sealed the promise between them. As they stood embracing under the vast Montana sky, Xavier thought about the remarkable chain of events that had led to this moment, how hunger and desperation had brought two young women to his door, how a simple act of kindness in offering bread had opened the door to love and family he'd never thought to find again. Sometimes, he reflected, the greatest journeys begin with the smallest steps. And sometimes, the most profound changes come not from grand gestures but from simple acts of human decency, like offering shelter to those in need and asking them, in one way or another, to stay forever. The rest of January and February passed in a flurry of activity as they prepared for both spring and the new cabin. On days when the weather permitted, Xavier and the twins ventured to the building site, clearing snow and marking the foundation. During storms, they worked indoors, planning the layout and preparing materials. Word of their plans and of Xavier and Catherine's engagement spread quickly through Whiteridge when they made their monthly trip for supplies. Mrs. Peterson, ever the matchmaker at heart, took particular delight in the news. "I knew there was something special brewing when you brought those girls home," she told Xavier as she wrapped parcels of sugar and coffee. "A man doesn't stay alone forever, not when the right woman comes along." Xavier, still uncomfortable with being the subject of town gossip, merely nodded and paid for his purchases. But he couldn't deny the truth in her words or the pride he felt walking down the main street with Catherine on his arm, her sister beside them. Jenkins, the troublemaker from their first visit, had apparently moved on to a ranch further south, much to everyone's relief. In his place, Xavier noticed Charlotte drawing the attention of several eligible men in town, including the new schoolteacher, a serious young man from Boston who had come west for his health. "Mr. Harrington seems quite taken with you," Catherine teased her sister as they rode home, referring to the schoolteacher's obvious interest during their brief interaction at the general store. Charlotte blushed, adjusting her hat against the winter sun. "He's certainly educated," she allowed. And not hard on the eyes, Xavier chuckled. Educated men are overrated, he said with mock seriousness. Take it from one who used to be one. Both twins looked at him in surprise. Used to be what? Catherine asked. Xavier realized he'd never shared this part of his past with them. Educated, he clarified. I attended university in Virginia for 2 years before my father's death required me to return home and earn a living. What did you study? Charlotte asked, clearly intrigued by this new information. Literature, primarily, Xavier admitted. Had notions of becoming a professor someday. Catherine shook her head in wonder. Every time I think I know you, Xavier Blackwood, you reveal another layer. Like an onion, he suggested with a raised eyebrow. Like a book, she corrected, smiling, one I'll never tire of reading. By early March, the worst of winter had passed, though snow still blanketed the ground and nighttime temperatures remained below freezing. The foundation for Charlotte's cabin was laid a simple rectangle that would eventually house a main room with a small sleeping area partitioned off. As they worked side by side, setting the corner posts and beginning to frame the walls, Xavier found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed in just a few months. The physical labor was the same as it had always been, but the purpose behind it was transformed. He was no longer building just for himself, but for the family he was creating. Family. The word still surprised him when it crossed his mind. After the war, after losing so many friends and comrades, he'd convinced himself that solitude was safer than connection. The twins had shattered that illusion completely. Penny for your thoughts, Catherine said, handing him a nail as they worked on framing a window. Xavier took the nail, their fingers brushing in a touch that still sent warmth through him. Just thinking about how different everything is now. Catherine nodded, understanding without need for elaboration. Do you ever regret it, taking us in that day? Xavier paused in his hammering to look at her directly. Not for a single moment, he said with absolute conviction. She smiled, reaching up to brush a wood shaving from his shoulder. Good, because there's no getting rid of us now. Wouldn't dream of it, he assured her, leaning down to steal a quick kiss. If you two are finished being sweet on each other, Charlotte called from where she was measuring boards for the roof, there's work to be done before sundown. They laughed, returning to their tasks with renewed energy. By nightfall, the basic structure of the cabin was taking shape, walls framed if not yet enclosed, the outline of a door and windows visible. That night, Xavier surprised the twins with an announcement over dinner. I've been corresponding with Reverend Thomas in Whiteridge, he said casually, referring to the town's preacher. He's agreed to ride out here the first Sunday in April, weather permitting. Catherine set down her fork. For the wedding? She asked, her eyes bright with excitement. Xavier nodded. If that suits you, I know it's not much notice, it's perfect, Catherine interrupted, reaching across the table to take his hand. A spring wedding, here in the place that brought us together. Charlotte raised her cup in a toast. To April weddings and new beginnings, she said warmly. As they clinked their cups together, Xavier felt a sense of contentment so deep it seemed to reach into his very bones. This was what he'd been searching for all along, though he hadn't known it not just a place to exist, but a place to belong. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Charlotte's cabin progressed rapidly, with all three of them working whenever weather permitted. By the end of March, it was enclosed and weathertight, with a small stone fireplace and chimney that Xavier had built with particular care. Meanwhile, preparations for the wedding occupied much of their indoor time. Catherine worked on a special dress, adapting one of her better garments with lace trim purchased from Mrs. Peterson. Charlotte crafted decorations from dried flowers and pine cones, and Xavier rode into town twice to ensure that everything would be ready for the Reverend's visit. On one such trip, he returned with an unexpected package. What's this? Catherine asked as he placed the small velvet box in her hand. Open it, he encouraged, trying to hide his nervousness. Inside was a simple gold band with a small pearl set in the center, nothing elaborate, but finely crafted and beautiful in its simplicity. "Xavier," Catherine breathed, her eyes wide. "It's beautiful, but how did you?" "I've been saving for years," he explained. "Never had much to spend money on out here, thought it was time to put some of it to good use." Catherine slipped the ring on her finger, admiring how it caught the light. "I'll treasure it always," she promised, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. The night before the wedding, after Charlotte had tactfully retired early, Xavier and Catherine sat together on the porch swing he'd built the previous summer but rarely used until the twins arrived. "Nervous?" he asked, noting the way she fidgeted with her new ring. Catherine smiled. "A little." "Not about marrying you," she clarified quickly. "Just about everything changing." Xavier understood. Despite their certainty about their feelings for each other, marriage represented a significant shift in their relationship and living arrangements. "Good changes, I hope," he said. "The best," she assured him, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But still changes." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the forest around them. The air had the particular freshness of early spring, cold but with a hint of growing things beneath the lingering snow. "I never told you," Xavier said finally, "about the night you and Charlotte arrived." Catherine looked up at him questioningly. "I'd been hunting all day," he continued. "When I returned and saw smoke from my chimney, I almost shot first and asked questions later." Catherine's eyes widened. "You never said..." "Because I'm ashamed of how close I came to making a terrible mistake," Xavier admitted. "One moment of fear or anger could have destroyed what's become the most precious thing in my life." He took her hand, his expression solemn. "I promise you this, Catherine. Every day of our life together, I'll try to choose kindness over fear, understanding over anger. I can't promise I'll always succeed. I'm still learning how to be the man you deserve, but I'll never stop trying." Catherine's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "That's all any of us can do," she said softly. "Try our best each day and forgive ourselves and each other when we fall short." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his beard. "I love you, Xavier. Not because you're perfect, but because you're perfectly yourself with all your strength and vulnerability, your wisdom and your doubts." Xavier turned his head to kiss her palm, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling between them. "Tomorrow can't come soon enough," he murmured. Catherine smiled. "It will come in its own time, just like we did." The wedding day dawned clear and mild, as if nature itself approved of the union. Reverend Thomas arrived mid-morning, his weathered face creasing in a broad smile as Xavier greeted him at the edge of the property. "Fine place you've built here, Blackwood," the Reverend observed, taking in the main cabin and the smaller one nearby, now nearly complete. "Even finer family you're starting." The ceremony itself was simple but heartfelt. They held it outside, in the clearing between the two cabins, with Charlotte as the only witness besides the Reverend. Catherine wore her modified dress, with early spring wildflowers woven into her hair by her sister's careful hands. Xavier had shaved his beard for the occasion, revealing a face younger and more vulnerable than Catherine was accustomed to seeing. As they spoke their vows beneath the vast Montana sky, with mountains as their witnesses and the scent of pine in the air, both felt the rightness of the moment of two lives converging to form something new and stronger. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Thomas concluded, his voice carrying clearly in the spring air, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Their first kiss as a married couple was sweet and brief, mindful of their audience, but filled with promise for the life they would build together. Charlotte embraced them both afterward, her joy for them evident despite the tears that sparkled in her eyes. "Mother and father would be so proud," she whispered to Catherine, "so happy to see you so loved." The remainder of the day was spent in quiet celebration. The Reverend stayed for the wedding meal that Charlotte had prepared with special care, then departed with promises to visit again in the summer to see how they were all faring. As twilight fell, Charlotte tactfully retired to her new cabin, though it was still missing some finishing touches. "Time you two had some privacy," she said with a wink that made Catherine blush furiously. Left alone for the first time as husband and wife, Xavier and Catherine stood somewhat awkwardly in the main room of what was now their home. "Well, Mrs. Blackwood," Xavier said softly, still marveling at how natural the name sounded. "What shall we do with our evening?" Catherine's shy smile as she took his hand and led him toward their bedroom was answer enough. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Catherine's head resting on his chest and his arms around her, Xavier thought about the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. From strangers seeking shelter to family bound by love, they had traveled a path neither could have foreseen. "What are you thinking?" Catherine murmured, her voice drowsy with contentment. Xavier smiled in the darkness, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I'm thinking that offering bread to hungry strangers was the best decision I ever made," Catherine laughed softly. "And asking them to stay forever was the second best." "No," Xavier corrected gently. "Asking you to stay forever was the best. The bread was just the beginning." Outside, a gentle spring rain began to fall, its soft pattering on the roof a soothing lullaby. Inside, two people who had found each other against all odds drifted to sleep in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. 5 years later, Xavier stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, watching as two small figures raced across the yard toward him, their laughter carrying on the summer breeze. "Papa, Papa," called his 4-year-old son, James, named for the friend whose fiddle still hung on their wall. "Look what we found." Close behind came 3-year-old Elizabeth, her dark curls bouncing as she struggled to keep up with her brother. "Bird nest," she announced proudly as they reached the porch steps. Xavier crouched down to examine the empty nest they presented for his inspection. "That's a fine find," he said seriously. "Where did you discover it?" "In the pine tree by Aunt Charlotte's garden," James explained. "It fell down in the storm last night." "Well, that's very interesting," Xavier said, ruffling his son's hair. "Why don't you show your mother?" "She's just finished baking bread." At the mention of fresh bread, both children's eyes lit up, and they scampered inside, calling for Catherine. Xavier straightened, smiling as he watched them go. The sound of children's laughter in his home still amazed him, sometimes a blessing he'd never dared hope for in his solitary days. From the direction of the second cabin, now expanded and improved over the years, he saw Charlotte approaching. She carried a basket of vegetables from her garden, her pace unhurried in deference to her growing belly. "How are you feeling today?" Xavier called as she drew nearer. Charlotte smiled, one hand resting on her 7-month pregnancy. "Like I'm carrying a future blacksmith," she replied good-naturedly. "This one kicks harder than James ever did." Xavier chuckled, taking the heavy basket from her. "William says the same about his first son, so perhaps it runs in the family." Charlotte's husband, William Harrington, the schoolteacher who had caught her eye in Whiteridge all those years ago, had proven to be a perfect match for her independent spirit. They had married 3 years after Xavier and Catherine, settling into the smaller cabin with William making the daily ride to town to teach during the school terms. "Is Catherine still planning on riding into town tomorrow?" Charlotte asked as they entered the main cabin together. "If the weather holds," Xavier confirmed. "She's determined to speak to the town council about starting a proper library." Catherine looked up from where she was examining the children's nest discovery, her face as beautiful to Xavier now as it had been on the day they wed. "Someone has to bring civilization to this wilderness," she said with mock seriousness. The years had been good to them all. Whiteridge had grown into a proper town with the arrival of the railway, bringing new opportunities and connections to the wider world. Xavier's hunting skills and Catherine's organizational abilities had allowed them to establish a successful trading business, supplying meat and hides to markets as far away as Denver. Charlotte and William had integrated education into their lives in unexpected ways, with Charlotte teaching the children music and literature, while William instructed them in mathematics and science during the summer months, when school was not in session. The twins, though still identical in appearance save for Catherine's marriage ring and Charlotte's wedding band, had developed more distinct personalities as they established their separate lives. Catherine's passion for reading had evolved into advocacy for education in the growing community, while Charlotte's love of music had led her to organize the town's first musical performances. As they gathered around the table for the evening meal, an extended family created not by birth, but by choice and circumstance, Xavier found himself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. From a solitary man haunted by the past to the patriarch of a thriving family. From a pair of desperate, hungry twins to confident women who had built meaningful lives in a place they now called home. It was a transformation none of them could have imagined on that fateful day when hunger and kindness first brought them together. After dinner, as the children played a game of checkers under Charlotte and William's supervision, Xavier and Catherine stepped outside to enjoy the summer evening. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "It's still as beautiful as the first time I saw it," Catherine remarked, leaning against the porch railing. "Do you remember how nervous we were that first night, wondering if you might turn us away come morning?" Xavier slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her close. "I remember thinking you might disappear like a dream if I closed my eyes." Catherine laughed, the sound as delightful to him now as it had been when he first heard it. "Instead, we multiplied," she said, nodding toward the house where their children's voices could be heard. "Best kind of mathematics," Xavier agreed with a smile. They stood in comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. Behind them, the sounds of family life continued: children's laughter, Charlotte's gentle admonishment, William's patient explanation of some rule of the game. "Are you happy, Catherine?" Xavier asked suddenly, turning to study his wife's face in the fading light. Catherine looked surprised by the question. "Completely," she answered without hesitation. "Are you?" Xavier nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible. More than I believed I deserved." Catherine reached up to touch his face, her palm warm against his cheek. "Love isn't about deserving," she said softly. "It's about recognizing each other across all distances and circumstances, about offering what you have even if it's just bread when it's needed most." Xavier turned his head to kiss her palm, a gesture that had become a familiar expression of tenderness between them over the years. "You are wise beyond your years, Mrs. Blackwood. I learned from a certain reclusive cowboy with unexpected depths," she teased. As twilight deepened into evening, they remained on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. Inside, the sounds of their family, both blood and chosen, created a symphony of belonging that filled Xavier's heart to overflowing. Once, he had built this cabin as a refuge from the world, a place to hide away with his regrets and memories. Now, it stood as something far greater, a home in the truest sense, filled with love and laughter, with hardships shared and joys multiplied. And it had all begun with a simple act of kindness when two hungry twins knocked on his door. A cowboy gave them bread, and in time, asked them to stay forever. In that moment of generosity, none of them could have known they were taking the first steps on a journey that would transform their lives completely. But perhaps that was the nature of true kindness, not calculating the return, but offering what one has in the moment it's needed most. As Xavier led his wife back inside to join their family, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with grand gestures or bold declarations, but with small acts of human decency that open doors to possibilities none could have imagined. And in that knowledge was a wisdom worth passing on to their children, and their children's children, that love, like bread shared with strangers, multiplies when given freely, nourishing not just those who receive it, but those who have the courage to offer it as well.